I stood outside the glass doors of the Meridian Grand Hotel, watching my wife Sarah laugh with her colleagues through the polished windows, and I felt the weight of 3 years pressing down on my chest like a physical force. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what I was about to do, the knowledge that in the next hour, everything would change. For 3 years, I had been the invisible husband, the one they whispered about at office parties, the man who supposedly couldn't provide, couldn't compete, couldn't measure up to the corporate titans Sarah worked alongside. I had heard every comment, absorbed every pitying look, endured every subtle insult with a smile that never quite reached my eyes. Tonight, that narrative would shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Tonight, Samuel Mitchell would walk into that company dinner uninvited, and by the time I left, every single person in that room would understand the most dangerous mistake you can make in business and in life. Assuming the quiet ones have nothing to say, nothing to offer, nothing to reveal that could turn your entire world upside down. What I carried in my jacket pocket wasn't just documents, wasn't just legal papers or stock certificates. It was 3 years of humiliation, sacrifice, strategic planning, and a secret so explosive that when I revealed it, careers would end, reputations would crumble, relationships would fracture, and my wife would finally see the man she married, not through the lens of her colleagues' mockery, not through the filter of corporate expectations, but through the harsh, unforgiving light of undeniable truth. The CEO who was about to insult me, who was about to tell me I didn't belong, had no idea that with one signature, with one phone call, with one decision, I could remove him from his position and destroy everything he'd built. Her boss, who would look me up and down with contempt, who had spent years making subtle jokes about house husbands and failed ambitions, didn't know that I had been watching every quarterly report, every board meeting summary, every decision, every arrogant move they made with my company. Because that's what it was. Mine. 85% mine. And they were about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the man holding the majority of shares, the man who has been building an empire while you mocked him for having no ambition. The lobby felt colder than it should have, marble floors reflecting the crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls above me, each piece of cut glass catching the light and throwing it back in fragments, much like how my life had been fragmented over these past 3 years. I could hear the dinner party from here, the artificial laughter of people who measured their worth in bonuses and corner offices, who believed that success could only look one way, sound one way, present itself according to a very specific set of rules that I had deliberately chosen to break. My reflection in the polished surface showed a man in a simple black suit, no designer label visible, no flashy accessories, no Rolex watch or Italian leather shoes that screamed expensive taste. I looked exactly like what they expected. Unremarkable, forgettable, beneath their notice, someone who had clearly given up on the game they were all playing. Perfect. I had dressed this way intentionally, with the same care a general might take in planning a military campaign. When you're about to detonate someone's entire worldview, presentation matters tremendously. Not in the way they think, where expensive clothes equal success and power, but in the contrast, in the gap between what they see and what actually exists underneath that surface. The greater the underestimation, the more devastating the revelation. The wider the chasm between their assumptions and reality, the more complete their shock would be when the truth finally emerged. I learned that from my father, a man who built 3 separate business empires while wearing clothes from discount stores, who taught me that real power doesn't announce itself with gold watches and Italian leather, doesn't need the validation of external markers of success. Real power waits, observes, learns everything it can about its opponents and allies alike, and strikes precisely when the target feels most secure, most comfortable in their own superiority. 3 years ago, I had walked away from a career that would have impressed everyone in that ballroom, would have earned me the respect and admiration that Sarah's colleagues withheld so deliberately now. I had been on track to make partner at Caldwell and Associates, one of the most prestigious investment firms in the country, pulling 18-hour days, sacrificing weekends and holidays, missing family events and personal milestones, all for a title and a salary that would have made Sarah's colleagues respect me, would have given me the external validation that society tells us matters so much. But I had seen too many men in those firms, hollow behind their expensive suits, trading their souls and their health, and any sense of authentic self for validation from people who would forget them the moment they stopped being useful, the moment their quarterly numbers dipped or their political capital ran out. I watched them age prematurely, watched their marriages crumble, watched them achieve everything they thought they wanted only to discover it was empty, meaningless, a performance for an audience that didn't actually care about them as human beings. So I made a choice that confused everyone, including Sarah, including my own family, including friends who thought they knew what I wanted from life. I quit. I walked away from the partnership track, from the salary, from the prestige, from everything that looked like success to the outside world. I took my savings, which was substantial after years of those 18-hour days. I took my connections built over a decade in the investment world. I took my understanding of how corporate structures really work beneath all the public-facing presentations, and I disappeared into the background of our marriage, became the husband who didn't work, the man who had given up, the embarrassing secret that Sarah tried to avoid mentioning at company events. What they didn't know, what Sarah herself didn't fully understand despite my attempts to explain in ways that wouldn't compromise the plan, was that I had been building something far more substantial than a career, far more powerful than a partnership at an investment firm. I had been acquiring power in its most fundamental form, ownership. The company Sarah worked for, Hexagon Industries, had been my target from the very beginning, from the moment I started researching which companies were both valuable and vulnerable, which organizations had potential being squandered by incompetent leadership. Not because I wanted to destroy it out of spite or revenge, but because I saw its genuine potential, and I saw how catastrophically badly it was being mismanaged by people who cared more about appearances than results. The CEO, Richard Caldwell, was a charismatic fraud of the highest order, the kind of leader who excelled at investor presentations and board meetings but failed completely at actual strategy, at building sustainable value, at making the hard decisions that leadership requires. He had been running Hexagon into the ground slowly, carefully, in ways that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers or even to most board members until it was far too late to save. But I had seen the patterns, had spent months analyzing their financial reports, had noticed the creative accounting that made quarterly results look better than they were, had tracked the declining innovation metrics, the brain drain of top talent, the stagnation masquerading as stability, and I realized that within 5 years, maybe less, everyone who worked there, including my wife, would be desperately job hunting as Hexagon collapsed or got acquired for parts by a competitor. So I started buying shares, quietly, carefully, through shell companies and investment vehicles that couldn't be traced back to me directly without extensive forensic accounting. Every time Hexagon stock dipped because of another one of Caldwell's strategic mistakes, because of a product launch that failed, because of a quarterly report that disappointed analysts, I was there, buying at the reduced price. Every time they needed capital and issued new shares to raise funds, diluting existing shareholders, I was there, hidden behind corporate structures that Richard's team never bothered to investigate thoroughly because they assumed anyone with serious money would make themselves known, would seek board representation, would want the visibility and influence that they believe came with large shareholdings. Over 3 years, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, I accumulated 85% ownership of the company my wife worked for, the company whose CEO was about to tell me I wasn't invited to this dinner, whose employees had spent years treating me like a failure. The irony was almost poetic in its completeness. Sarah had been begging me to do something with my life for months now, her frustration growing as I deflected her questions about what exactly I was doing with my days, why I seemed content to let her be the primary earner, why I wasn't more ambitious in ways she could understand and explain to her colleagues. Her colleagues had been less subtle in their contempt, making comments at the few social gatherings I had attended, asking when I was going to get back out there in the job market, suggesting openings they'd heard about at other companies, their voices dripping with the kind of pity that's really just disguised contempt, the kind of concern that's actually judgment dressed up in polite language. Her boss, Jennifer Hartley, had been the worst of all, constantly undermining me in subtle ways that were designed to avoid direct confrontation while still making her opinions crystal clear, making jokes about hardworking women and their house husbands, laughing a little too loudly when Sarah mentioned I was handling some personal projects, turning my name into a kind of punchline that everyone was in on except me. Personal projects. If they only knew. If they had any conception of what those personal projects actually entailed. If they could see the spreadsheets and analysis and strategic planning that filled my days. If they understood that those projects included restructuring their entire company's ownership, preparing a comprehensive analysis of every financial mistake Richard had made over his tenure, documenting every questionable decision and missed opportunity, and planning down to the minute the exact moment when I would reveal all of it in a way that would maximize impact and minimize the possibility of any effective countermove. They might have chosen their words more carefully. But people like Jennifer and Richard don't think that way, don't consider possibilities outside their narrow understanding of how the world works. They exist in bubbles of their own importance, surrounded by people who validate their superiority, who confirm their assumptions, who never challenge their fundamental understanding of the social and corporate hierarchy. And they never seriously consider that the quiet man in the corner, the one they've dismissed as irrelevant, might be the most dangerous person in the room. I pushed through the doors, and the noise hit me immediately like a physical wave. The ballroom was exactly what I expected: excessive, expensive, designed to impress rather than to welcome or create genuine connection. Round tables covered in white linens, each centerpiece a small fortune in exotic flowers arranged by someone whose job was specifically to make wealthy people feel like their money was being spent on beautiful things. The kind of event where the cost per plate could feed a family for a week, where the wine selection represented more thought than the actual content of any conversation that would happen here. This was how Hexagon spent its money, on displays of success rather than actual investment in innovation or employee development or the kind of research and development that would secure their future. This was why they were failing, though only I seemed to realize it yet, though the signs were there for anyone who bothered to look beneath the surface performance. The moment I stepped inside, the energy shifted in a way that was almost tangible, like a ripple spreading across water. Conversations didn't stop immediately, but there was a wave effect, heads turning, recognition spreading across faces followed quickly by confusion, by the cognitive dissonance of seeing someone in a space where they clearly didn't belong according to the established social rules. I wasn't supposed to be here. Sarah had made that clear this morning when I asked casually about the dinner, trying to gauge whether she would mention my invitation. "It's just a company thing, honey. You'd be bored. Besides, it's really just for employees and board members." Translation: please don't embarrass me in front of my colleagues by existing in your current state of professional irrelevance. By reminding them that I'm married to someone they all consider a failure. That I had smiled, kissed her cheek, told her to have a good time, watched her leave in the dress she'd spent 2 weeks choosing because she wanted to make the right impression on people whose opinions mattered to her far more than mine seemed to. I hadn't mentioned that I'd received my own invitation, not as Sarah's husband, not as anyone's plus one, but as the majority shareholder of Hexagon Industries, an invitation that had been sent to one of my corporate addresses, generated automatically by Richard's executive assistant, who had no idea who she was actually inviting, who had simply pulled the name from the shareholder registry without understanding the implications. The whole thing would have been funny if it weren't so perfectly symbolic of how disconnected Hexagon's leadership was from reality, how little attention they paid to the actual structure of their own company. Sarah spotted me first, and I watched the recognition hit her like a physical blow. She was standing near the bar, wine glass in hand, mid-laugh at something one of her colleagues had said, probably another joke at my expense if the pattern of these events held true. When our eyes met across the crowded room, her expression went through a fascinating evolution that I could read even from this distance. Surprise that I was here at all, confusion about how I'd gotten past whatever screening process she assumed existed, concern about what this meant for her social standing among these people, and finally a kind of frozen panic as she started calculating how to minimize the damage of my presence. She excused herself from her group quickly, her smile tight and artificial, her movements betraying the urgency she was trying to hide, and started walking toward me with clear intent to intercept, to ask what I was doing here, to suggest as politely as possible that maybe I should leave before anyone important noticed, before I could cause the scene she clearly feared I was about to make. But someone important had already noticed. Richard Caldwell, CEO of Hexagon Industries, master of the quarterly earnings call, champion of corporate buzzwords and empty strategy sessions that produced elaborate PowerPoint presentations, but no actual strategic direction, was looking directly at me from across the room, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was a tall man, fit in the way that comes from expensive personal trainers and carefully managed diets, and probably some pharmaceutical assistants he would never publicly acknowledge. His silver hair styled perfectly by someone who charged more for a haircut than most people spend on groceries in a month. His suit probably worth more than most of his employees' monthly rent. He had the kind of presence that filled rooms effortlessly, the kind of voice that made people listen even when he wasn't saying anything particularly meaningful, the charisma that had gotten him this position despite his fundamental lack of strategic competence. He started walking toward me, and I could see him trying to place me, trying to remember if I was someone important he'd forgotten, someone whose name he should know, some investor or board member he'd somehow overlooked. When recognition finally hit, when he realized I was just Sarah's husband, the failed spouse she tried not to mention, his expression changed completely and dramatically. His jaw tightened visibly, his eyes narrowed with something between contempt and annoyance, and that famous charismatic smile that had charmed countless investors vanished completely, replaced by something cold and dismissive and designed to make me feel as small as possible. "Samuel," he said, my name sounding like an accusation in his mouth, like he was identifying something unpleasant that had somehow contaminated his carefully curated event. "This is unexpected." He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that our conversation would be semi-private, but far enough that his body language clearly communicated I wasn't welcome in his personal space, that I was contaminating the air he breathed simply by being present. "I don't recall seeing your name on the guest list." Around us, people were starting to pay attention in the way that happens at corporate events when social hierarchy is being enforced, when someone is about to be put in their place publicly. Conversations dropped to whispers, heads turned with unconcealed interest, everyone sensing that something was about to happen, some small drama that would give them something to talk about later. Sarah had stopped walking, frozen halfway between the bar and where I stood with her boss, her face pale, her hand gripping her wine glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. Jennifer Hartley appeared at Richard's shoulder like she'd been summoned, her expression gleeful in that particular way people get when they think they're about to witness someone else's humiliation, when they believe they're on the winning side of a social conflict and can enjoy the spectacle of someone being destroyed. This was exactly the kind of drama these people lived for, I realized, watching the crowd gather like sharks sensing blood in the water. The social hierarchy enforcement disguised as concern for protocol, the public shaming dressed up as maintaining standards, the collective agreement that some people belong and others don't, and those who don't belong need to be reminded of it clearly and publicly so everyone understands their place. "You weren't invited," Richard continued, his voice carrying just enough volume that nearby tables could hear clearly, could understand that he was handling an unwanted intruder, maintaining the boundaries of their exclusive space. He was performing now, I realized, establishing dominance in front of his employees, making sure everyone understood that I was the rule breaker, the social transgressor, the man who didn't belong in their world of success and achievement. "This is a company event. Employees and board members only. I'm sure you understand." The room had gone almost completely quiet now, that particular silence that comes when everyone is pretending not to listen while listening with complete attention. Someone's fork clinked against a plate, the sound absurdly loud in the sudden hush, drawing a few nervous laughs that died quickly. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, watching, waiting for my response, expecting me to stammer out an apology, to back away embarrassed, to prove once again that I was exactly what they thought I was: insignificant, powerless, someone who had overstepped and was about to be put back in his proper place. I smiled. Not a big smile, nothing that would seem like overcompensation or nervousness. Just a small, calm smile, the kind that suggests you know something others don't, that you're holding cards they can't see, that their assumptions about the situation might be fundamentally flawed. "It's interesting you mention invitations, Richard," I said, my voice steady and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the wine rather than my right to exist in this space. "Because technically, I did receive one, to my corporate address, though I understand why there might be some confusion about that." Richard's eyebrow raised, his expression shifting from dismissive to irritated, The look of someone who thinks a minor annoyance is trying to become a major problem. Your corporate address? Samuel, I don't know what game you're playing here, but this really isn't. I'm not playing anything. I interrupted gently, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out a folded envelope, the movement deliberate and calm. I'm simply responding to the invitation sent to the majority shareholder of Hexagon Industries. That would be me, Richard. I own 85% of this company, which means, technically, this is my dinner too. In fact, one could argue that all of this, I gestured around the expensive ballroom, is happening with my money. The silence that followed was absolute and profound, not the polite quiet of people waiting for a speech to continue, but the shocked, breathless silence of a room full of people trying to process information that contradicts everything they thought they knew about reality. I could actually see the moment it hit them, could watch the collective realization spreading across faces like a wave of cold water. Mouths opened slightly in shock, eyes widened in disbelief. Wine glasses tilted and forgotten before people caught themselves. Someone's phone slipping from their hand and clattering onto the floor without anyone moving to pick it up. The sound echoed in the silence like a gunshot. Richard's face went through a remarkable transformation that would have been fascinating to document if I hadn't been so focused on maintaining my own composure. The confident, dismissive expression cracked like glass under pressure, color draining from his cheeks so quickly I wondered if he might actually faint, his carefully maintained composure shattering into something raw and panicked as his brain tried to process what I'd just said and calculate the implications. He reached for the envelope I was holding with a hand that shook slightly, his fingers trembling in a way that betrayed just how deeply this revelation had shaken him. No longer the commanding CEO, but a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor and someone had just pulled the lever. Sarah made a small sound, almost a gasp, but more strangled, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as if she could somehow take back her reaction, push it back inside. Her eyes were huge, filled with confusion and something else, something that might have been horror or betrayal or simple shock as she started to understand the implications, as all those conversations about me needing to contribute more, about finding my purpose, about not living up to my potential, started playing back in her head with completely different context. With the understanding that while she'd been worried about our financial future, I'd been quietly accumulating enough wealth and power to change everything. Jennifer Hartley, who had been smirking just moments ago with that particular expression of someone who thinks they're about to watch an enemy get destroyed, looked like she'd been physically slapped, her mouth open in an expression of comical shock, the schadenfreude draining from her face as she realized that the man she'd been mocking, the husband she'd been pitying and using as a punchline, held more power than everyone in this room combined, could end her career with a phone call, could make her unemployable in this industry with a single decision. I let the moment breathe, not rushing to fill the silence, understanding that this was important, that this was the pivot point where everything changed. Power dynamics don't shift gradually through negotiation and compromise. They shatter and reform in moments like this, in sudden revelations that rewrite everyone's understanding of reality. And the more sudden the change, the more complete the transformation, the more thoroughly the old hierarchy dissolves and something new takes its place. I wanted them to feel it fully, to sit in the discomfort of having every assumption they'd made about me, about themselves, about how the world worked, revealed as fundamentally wrong. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I continued after letting the silence stretch long enough that people were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats, desperate for someone to break the tension. For the past 3 years, while many of you have been very concerned about my career prospects, while you've been making jokes at company parties about house husbands and failed ambitions, while you've been pitying my wife for being married to someone so clearly unsuccessful, I've been quite busy. Acquiring shares through various corporate structures, analyzing quarterly reports in detail that would bore most people to tears, watching how this company operates from the outside, studying every decision, every strategic move, every allocation of resources. I paused, looking around the room slowly, making eye contact with several people who had made particularly cutting comments about me at previous events, watching them squirm under my gaze. And I have to say, I've been deeply disappointed with what I've seen. Richard found his voice, though it came out rougher than his usual polished tone, lacking the commanding quality that usually made people listen. This is, Samuel, I don't understand. The share registry would have shown. How could you possibly have accumulated that much without us knowing? Without triggering disclosure requirements. Shell companies, I explained simply, as if I were describing something mundane rather than a 3-year strategic acquisition campaign. Multiple investment vehicles carefully structured to stay below individual reporting thresholds. Corporate structures specifically designed to obscure beneficial ownership until the right moment for revelation. It's all perfectly legal, Richard, as I'm sure your lawyers will confirm when you ask them to investigate, which I know you will immediately after this conversation. Though I'm surprised your team didn't catch it during routine shareholder analysis. Then again, that's part of the problem, isn't it? The attention to detail at Hexagon has been slipping badly for quite some time. You've been so focused on the performance, on the quarterly presentations, on managing the board's perception, that you've neglected the fundamentals of actually understanding your own company's structure. I started walking slowly between the tables, and people actually leaned back as I passed, as if proximity to me might somehow contaminate them with their own misconceptions, might force them to confront their own assumptions about power and success. The power shift was visceral now. You could feel it in the air like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, in the way people held themselves differently, in the sudden uncertainty that had replaced all their comfortable assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. The thing about power, I said, not speaking to anyone in particular, but knowing that everyone was listening with complete attention, hanging on every word, is that it's not always obvious. It doesn't always announce itself with corner offices and executive titles. Sometimes it hides behind a quiet presence, behind someone who seems to have stepped away from the game entirely. Sometimes it waits, patiently, while everyone else makes assumptions based on surface appearances. Sometimes it builds infrastructure in complete silence while everyone else is distracted by the performance, by the visible markers of success that don't actually mean anything fundamental. I stopped walking, turning to face Richard again, watching his expression carefully. You assumed I was nothing because I wasn't performing my worth in ways you recognized, in ways that fit your narrow understanding of what success looks like. That was your first mistake, Richard, and it was a catastrophic one. Jennifer stepped forward, her voice sharp despite the tremor underneath that betrayed her actual emotional state. Even if this is true, even if you've somehow managed to acquire shares without our knowledge, you can't just walk in here and... I can, I said simply, cutting her off with 2 words that carried the weight of legal fact rather than opinion. That's what majority ownership means, Jennifer. I can walk in anywhere in this company, any building, any office, any meeting. I can review any decision that's been made, question any allocation of resources, examine any strategic direction. I can, if I choose to exercise my rights as majority shareholder, replace anyone who isn't performing to standard, anyone whose contribution to company value doesn't justify their compensation. I let that sink in for a moment, watching the fear spread across faces as people realized what I was really saying, including the CEO. Especially the CEO, actually, since CEO performance has the greatest impact on overall company value. The fear that flashed across Richard's face was gratifying in a way I hadn't entirely anticipated, a validation of 3 years of work and planning and enduring humiliation. For 3 years, I had listened to the subtle condescension, absorbed the pitying looks, endured the suggestions that I needed to be more like him, more ambitious, more successful by their definition. I had watched him at company events, seen how people deferred to him, how they laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, how they agreed with his opinions even when they were clearly wrong, all because of his position and the power everyone assumed came with it. And now he stood there, his entire career in my hands, every assumption he'd made about his own security revealed as based on a foundation of ignorance, of not understanding the actual power structure of his own company. Sarah approached slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were approaching something dangerous that might lash out unpredictably. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs spreading through the room. "Why didn't you tell me? All this time, when I was asking you to get a job, to do something with your life, when I was worried about our future, you were building an empire." I finished for her, my voice gentle but firm. But you couldn't see it because it didn't look like what you expected success to look like. It didn't come with a title on a business card or an office with my name on the door or invitations to speak at industry conferences. So you assumed I was failing, that I'd given up, that I was wasting my potential. The pain in her eyes was real and deep, and part of me felt it too, felt the cost of what this revelation meant for us. Do you know how many times I almost told you? How many times I wanted to defend myself when your colleagues made their little jokes, when Jennifer implied I was a burden to you, when Richard here suggested job openings he thought might be suitable for someone of my limited abilities. But I couldn't, because the moment I revealed what I was doing, it would have changed everything. The acquisition had to stay hidden until it was complete, until I had accumulated enough shares that removing me would be impossible. And I needed to see who people really were when they thought I had no power, when they felt safe showing their true nature. The truth about someone's character comes out when they think there are no consequences for revealing it. An older man I recognized as Harold Chun, one of the senior board members, and someone who had been with Hexagon since its early days, stood up slowly from his table, his expression careful and controlled. He was pale, clearly shaken by this revelation, but trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "Mr. Mitchell, I think we should discuss this privately. Perhaps we could convene in one of the hotel's conference rooms, and—" "No," I said firmly, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "We're going to discuss this right here, right now, in front of everyone who works for this company. Because this isn't just about corporate structure or share ownership or legal technicalities. This is about culture, about how this company treats people, about the toxic assumptions that have been allowed to flourish under Richard's leadership, about the gap between how Hexagon presents itself and how it actually operates." I turned back to face the CEO directly. "Did you know, Richard, that your employee retention rate has dropped by 34% over the past 2 years? Did you know that your best engineers, the people who actually create value for this company, are actively updating their resumes because they feel undervalued and ignored? Did you know that the innovation that used to define Hexagon, that made this company respected in the industry, has been stagnating because you're more focused on quarterly presentations and managing board perception than on actually investing in research and development?" Richard's face was red now, anger mixing visibly with his fear, his hands clenching at his sides. "You have no right to come in here, and—" "I have every right," I said, my voice harder now, dropping the conversational tone and letting real steel show through. "I have 85% of the rights, to be mathematically exact. And I've been watching very carefully, Richard. I've seen exactly how you operate, how you run this company like it's your personal kingdom rather than an entity you're supposed to be stewarding for shareholders and employees. The expensive dinners like this one, while cutting research budgets that actually drive innovation. The executive bonuses that keep growing even as you freeze employee salaries. The focus on quarterly earnings manipulation rather than long-term sustainable growth. The consulting contracts awarded to your former colleagues at firms that provide no measurable value but generate very nice fees. You've been running this company like you're entitled to it, like you own it, and you forgot the most important rule of corporate leadership. You're expendable. Everyone is expendable, including me. But the difference is, I remember that fundamental truth. You forgot it completely." The room was absolutely silent now, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that feels physical, that presses down on everyone present. People weren't just watching anymore, weren't just observing drama unfold. They were understanding that this wasn't a simple confrontation or a personality conflict. This was a reckoning, a complete dismantling of the social and corporate hierarchy they'd all been operating under, a fundamental rewriting of power structures that would affect every single person in this room. I pulled out several documents from my jacket, thick folders of analysis and evidence I'd been compiling for months, spreading them on the nearest table so people could see them. These are comprehensive financial reports showing every questionable decision made over the past 3 years. The misallocated funds that went to pet projects rather than strategic investments. The research initiatives that were killed despite promising early results because they didn't fit your personal vision. The projects greenlit based on your personal preferences and political considerations rather than rigorous market analysis. The consulting fees paid to companies that provided no measurable value but happened to be run by your former fraternity brothers and golf buddies. I looked directly at Richard, watching his expression as he realized just how thoroughly I'd documented everything. Did you think no one would notice these patterns? Or did you just assume that the board members you'd carefully selected for their willingness to rubber stamp your decisions, their loyalty to you personally rather than to the company, would never question you seriously enough to investigate? Harold Chun moved closer, his professional curiosity apparently overcoming his shock, looking at the documents with growing concern, his expression becoming more troubled with each page he examined. Other board members followed, drawn by some combination of duty and morbid fascination. A small crowd forming around the table, their whispered conversations adding to the tension, creating a low murmur of shock and dismay as they saw documented evidence of things they should have caught themselves. Sarah stood apart from everyone, watching me like I was a complete stranger, which in many fundamental ways, I suppose I was. She'd married a man she thought she knew, a man she thought she understood, but that man had been playing a role for 3 years, hiding his true nature and capabilities, waiting for this exact moment to reveal everything. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming, trying to reconcile the husband who couldn't seem to get his life together with the strategist who had just executed a flawless corporate takeover. "You're going to resign, Richard," I said quietly, but the words carried clearly in the silent room, dropping like stones into still water. "Tonight. Right now. You're going to stand up in front of all these people and announce that you're stepping down from your position as CEO effective immediately for personal reasons. You'll retain your stock options as per your original employment contract, which is actually quite generous considering your performance. But your time as CEO of Hexagon Industries ends right now. Tonight, in this ballroom. If you refuse, if you decide to fight this, I'll call an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. and remove you with cause, which according to your contract means you lose everything. The stock options, the severance package, the consulting arrangement, all of it. Your choice, Richard. But choose quickly, because my patience is not infinite." The power in that moment was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, a heady combination of vindication and responsibility that I hadn't fully prepared myself for despite all my planning. I could see in Richard's eyes that he was calculating frantically, trying to find some way out, some angle he could leverage, some card he could play that would change the situation. But there wasn't one. I had built this trap too carefully, had laid every piece of evidence too thoroughly, had structured the acquisition too precisely for there to be any escape route. He could fight, could make this messy and public and ugly, but fighting would only make his fall more painful and more complete, would destroy any possibility of future employment in this industry when word got out about the specific reasons for his removal. "This is insane," Jennifer said, her voice shrill now, all pretense of professional calm abandoned. "You can't just walk in here and destroy someone's career because you're on some kind of power trip, because you want to prove something to your wife, or..." "Because what, Jennifer?" I turned to her, and she actually took a step back, some primitive part of her brain finally recognizing actual danger. "Because I'm Sarah's quiet husband who you've been mocking for years? Because I don't fit your narrow image of what powerful people look like? Because I chose to build something real instead of just performing success for an audience?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice but keeping it audible to everyone watching. "Let me tell you something about power that you clearly don't understand. Real power doesn't need to announce itself constantly. It doesn't need validation or recognition from others. It doesn't measure itself by external markers like titles and office size. Real power works in silence, building foundations while everyone else is distracted by appearances and performance. You've been so busy judging me for not playing the game the way you understand it that you never considered I might be playing an entirely different game, operating at a completely different level. One I'm winning decisively." Her face flushed dark red, anger and humiliation mixing visibly, her hands trembling slightly. "Sarah," she said, turning desperately to my wife, "are you just going to stand there while he..." "While he what?" Sarah's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before, something new and sharp. "While he reveals that everything we thought we knew was wrong. While he shows us exactly how blind we've been, how willing we were to make assumptions without bothering to look deeper." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something breaking apart, reforming into something different. "I don't know who you are anymore, Samuel. Or maybe I never knew who you really were. I'm the same person I've always been, I said, and it was true in the ways that mattered most. The difference is now you can see all of me, not just the parts that fit comfortably into your expectations and understanding. I'm the man who loved you enough to endure 3 years of humiliation rather than risk this acquisition by revealing it too soon. I'm the man who watched your colleagues mock me at every company event and said nothing because the endgame was more important than protecting my ego in the moment. I'm the man who saw the company you work for slowly failing and decided to save it, to fix it, even though it meant sacrificing my own reputation and your respect for me to accomplish it. I paused, holding her gaze. But I'm also the man who's tired of being underestimated based on surface appearances. Tired of being treated like I'm less than human because I don't perform my worth in conventional ways that people recognize immediately. So yes, Sarah, this is who I am. All of it. The loving husband and the ruthless strategist. The patient supporter and the calculating corporate raider. The quiet observer and the man who just dismantled an entire power structure in less than 15 minutes. Richard had been whispering urgently with Harold Chun and 2 other board members in the corner. Their conversation heated but hushed, hands gesturing sharply as they argued about something. Finally, Richard turned back to me, and I could see in his body language that something fundamental had shifted. His shoulders had dropped slightly. The aggressive stance he'd been maintaining had softened into something more defeated. If I resign tonight, right now, you'll honor every provision of my employment contract? The stock options, the severance, the non-compete clause timeline? No legal challenges later. I'm not interested in destroying you personally, Richard, I said honestly, and I meant it despite everything. I'm interested in fixing this company, in saving the jobs of hundreds of people who depend on Hexagon for their livelihood, in restoring the innovation and excellence that used to define this organization. You're not a bad person. You're just not the right CEO for this company at this moment in its history. You can walk away with your dignity intact and your financial security preserved. You'll land somewhere else, probably somewhere that values your particular strengths more appropriately. But you have to walk away from Hexagon. The alternative is a very public removal with cause that will make it extremely difficult for you to find similar positions elsewhere, because boards talk to each other and word spreads quickly in this industry. It's your choice, but I need your answer now. He closed his eyes, and I watched his jaw working as he fought some internal battle, the last remnants of his pride and ego fighting against the cold logic of his situation. When he opened his eyes again, something essential had changed in them. The fight was gone, replaced by resignation and a kind of exhausted acceptance. Fine, he said, the word barely audible, carrying the weight of a complete surrender. I'll announce my resignation. Give me a few minutes to compose something appropriate to say. The next 40 minutes were surreal, like watching reality fold in on itself and reshape into something new. Richard stood at the front of the room at the small podium that had been set up for after-dinner speeches and delivered a brief, carefully worded resignation announcement, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities at this stage in his career, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hands when he gripped the podium. The room listened in stunned silence, still processing everything that had happened, trying to understand how their evening had transformed from a routine company dinner into this surreal corporate drama. When he finished, there was scattered, uncertain applause that died quickly, leaving an awkward void that no one seemed to know how to fill. Then Harold Chin stood, clearing his throat, his expression carefully neutral in the way that senior corporate officers learn to maintain in crisis situations. Given the extraordinary circumstances we've just witnessed, I think it's appropriate for the majority shareholder to say a few words about the future direction of Hexagon Industries. He looked at me, and there was genuine respect in his eyes now, mixed with wariness and uncertainty about what would come next. Samuel, I walked to the front of the room slowly, very aware of every eye on me. Every person in this ballroom reassessing their entire understanding of who I was, what I represented, what my presence in their lives would mean going forward. Sarah was watching from near the bar, her expression still unreadable, still processing. Jennifer had retreated to a corner table, her earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by visible fear about what my takeover would mean for her position. The other employees sat in various states of shock, confusion, and calculation, some already trying to figure out how to position themselves advantageously in the new order, others just trying to process what had happened. 3 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I made a decision that confused a lot of people, that disappointed my wife, that made me the subject of mockery and pity among people who thought they understood what success looks like. I walked away from what appeared to be a successful career, from a clear path to partnership at a prestigious firm, to pursue something that looked like nothing to outside observers. I became the cautionary tale, the guy who gave up, the husband who couldn't provide, the man who clearly couldn't handle the pressure of real corporate life. And I let people believe that narrative, allowed those assumptions to continue unchallenged, because what I was really doing required complete invisibility, required everyone to underestimate me so thoroughly that they wouldn't bother looking deeper. I paused, making eye contact with several people around the room. I've spent these 3 years watching this company with obsessive attention to detail, analyzing its strengths and critical weaknesses, understanding not just the financial numbers, but the culture, the people, the untapped potential that's being systematically wasted under leadership that prioritizes appearances over actual results. I pulled out another folder, this one containing projections and strategic plans I'd been developing over months of analysis. Hexagon Industries is failing. Not dramatically enough for most people to notice yet, not obviously enough to make headlines, but slowly, steadily, inexorably, in ways that will become catastrophic and irreversible within 5 years if nothing fundamental changes. Employee morale is at an all-time low according to every metric we can measure. Innovation has stagnated to the point where your patent filings are down 60% from 5 years ago. The best talent is actively leaving or making plans to leave, taking institutional knowledge and expertise to competitors. And all of this is happening while leadership focuses obsessively on maintaining appearances, on managing quarterly earnings perception, on expensive events like this dinner rather than investing in the research and development and human capital that actually creates sustainable value. There were uncomfortable shifts in seats around the room. People recognizing themselves and their colleagues and their own contributions to the problems I was describing, understanding that the criticism wasn't just aimed at Richard, but at a systemic cultural failure that many of them had participated in. But here's the thing that gives me hope. I continued, my tone shifting slightly. This company has incredible potential that's being squandered. The engineering talent working here right now is genuinely world-class. I've reviewed the credentials and past work of every senior engineer, and many of them are capable of innovation that could transform this industry. The patents you hold, even with the declining filing rate, represent valuable intellectual property that could be leveraged far more effectively. The market position you've established, if properly understood and strategically developed, could make Hexagon a leader in this industry again instead of a slowly declining also-ran. All of this is possible. All of this potential is real, but only if we make fundamental changes to how we operate, what we value, how we allocate resources and make strategic decisions. I outlined my vision for the company in detail, not holding back, giving them the full strategic analysis I'd been developing. Significantly increased R&D investment focused on specific technological areas where Hexagon had core competencies, complete overhaul of compensation structures to tie rewards to actual innovation and measurable contribution rather than political positioning and tenure. Implementation of transparent communication channels where ideas could flow freely from any level of the organization without being filtered through hierarchical gatekeepers. And most importantly, genuine accountability at every level of the organization, including and especially senior leadership. I talked about culture change, about creating an environment where the best ideas win regardless of who proposes them or what their position is in the formal hierarchy, where quiet competence and measurable results are valued as highly as or more highly than charismatic presentation and political skill. I described specific initiatives around diversity of thought, around creating psychological safety for people to challenge assumptions and propose unconventional solutions, around measuring what actually matters rather than what's easy to quantify. Some of you will thrive in this new environment, I said, looking around the room, making sure people understood this wasn't just abstract philosophy, but would have real consequences for their careers. Those of you whose value to this company is based on genuine skill, on real expertise, on the ability to solve complex problems and create innovative solutions. You're about to enter the most exciting and rewarding phase of your careers here. But some of you won't thrive, and I want to be clear about that too. If your primary value to this organization has been based on managing perceptions, navigating political hierarchies, maintaining relationships that don't serve the actual work, you're going to struggle significantly in what's coming. I'm not saying you're bad people or that you've done anything wrong within the context of how Hexagon has operated. But the rules are changing fundamentally, and not everyone will be able or willing to adapt. When I finished, the applause was different than what Richard had received earlier. It was uncertain but genuine, people responding not to social obligation or fear, but to possibility, to hope, to the idea that maybe things could actually improve. They were scared, I could see that in faces around the room. Confused about what this would mean for them personally, uncertain about whether to trust this vision. But I could also see, in some faces scattered throughout the crowd, something that might have been hope or excitement. The look of people who had been frustrated by the old system and were ready for something different. As the formal part of the evening ended and people began to leave, clustering in small groups to whisper about what had just happened, several employees approached me directly. Some came to introduce themselves properly for the first time, others to ask specific questions about the transition timeline and what it would mean for their departments. A few to simply acknowledge that they'd underestimated me completely and apologize for whatever role they'd played in the mockery and dismissal. I accepted their apologies graciously, understanding that people can only work with the information they have, and I had deliberately kept them in the dark, had actively encouraged their underestimation as part of my strategy. Sarah waited until almost everyone had left, standing by the entrance with her coat already on, her posture carefully controlled, her expression still that careful neutrality that I was learning to recognize as her way of processing overwhelming emotion. When I finally approached her, having finished the last of the conversations with employees, she didn't speak immediately, just looked at me with eyes that held too many emotions to separate cleanly. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, "to process all of this, to understand who you really are, or who you've been all along that I somehow couldn't see despite living with you every day for years." "I understand," I said, and I did, had actually prepared myself for this possibility during all my planning. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be here, Sarah. I'm not going anywhere." "Will you?" she asked, and there was a sharp challenge in her tone despite the quiet delivery. "Or is this just another strategic move, another calculated decision in some larger plan that I can't see, that you won't share with me until you decide the timing is right for maximum impact?" The pain in her words hit harder than I'd expected. "Sarah," I said quietly, "everything I've done over these 3 years, every decision I've made, I did while still being your husband, while still loving you. I didn't lie to you about my feelings or my commitment to our marriage. I just couldn't share everything else. Not yet. Not until the acquisition was complete and irreversible." She nodded slowly, but I could see the distance in her eyes, the emotional wall going up between us, protecting her from further hurt. "I'll see you at home," she said, and then she was gone, walking out into the night, leaving me standing in the now empty ballroom surrounded by the remnants of the evening, the abandoned wine glasses and half-eaten plates of expensive food that represented everything wrong with how Hexagon had been operating. I stayed for a while after everyone left, sitting alone in the quiet ballroom, processing what had happened and what it meant. The elation of victory was there, certainly. I had executed my plan flawlessly, had revealed my position at exactly the right moment for maximum impact, had successfully removed ineffective leadership and positioned myself to transform the company. But it was complicated by everything else, by the visible damage to my marriage, by the uncertainty of what came next, by the enormous weight of responsibility I had just publicly claimed. Owning 85% of a company sounds abstractly powerful, makes for a dramatic reveal at a dinner party, but the reality is thousands of people whose livelihoods now depend directly on my decisions, whose families and mortgages and dreams and fears are all connected to whether I can actually deliver on the ambitious vision I outlined tonight. Over the next several weeks, the transformation began in earnest, moving from abstract vision to concrete implementation. I brought in a new CEO, Maria Santos, a woman I'd been watching for years at one of Hexagon's primary competitors, someone with the perfect blend of deep technical understanding and proven leadership ability, someone who shared my philosophy about culture and innovation. Her first act as CEO was to conduct a comprehensive review of every department, every team, every significant ongoing project, identifying not just inefficiencies and redundancies, but, more importantly, underutilized talent and unexploited opportunities. Jennifer Hartley resigned within the first month, unable or unwilling to adapt to an environment where political maneuvering and hierarchical positioning were no longer valued over actual competence and measurable contribution. Several other executives followed her out the door over the next 2 months, some pushed out explicitly when their lack of real value became undeniable, others leaving voluntarily when they realized the old system wasn't coming back, that this wasn't a temporary disruption but a permanent transformation. But we also promoted extensively from within, elevating engineers and mid-level managers who had been systematically overlooked under Richard's regime, people who had real ideas and the demonstrated skills to execute them, but had been blocked by the political structure. The culture shift was significantly harder than the structural changes, exactly as I'd anticipated. You can change org charts and reporting lines overnight with a few signatures and announcements. You can alter compensation structures and decision-making processes through policy changes. But changing how people actually think, how they interact with each other, what they genuinely value, how they approach problems, that takes time and sustained effort and constant reinforcement. There was resistance, both open and subtle, resentment from people who felt their status and security diminishing, uncertainty from those who'd learned to survive by keeping their heads down and avoiding attention, but who were now being actively encouraged to speak up, to contribute ideas, to take risks that could result in visible failure. But slowly, incrementally, sometimes frustratingly gradually, but undeniably, things began to change in measurable ways. Employee satisfaction scores started rising in quarterly surveys. The brain drain stopped almost immediately, and within 3 months we were actually attracting significant talent from competitors, people who had heard about the cultural transformation and wanted to be part of it. Innovation metrics improved dramatically, patent filings increased, internal proposals for new projects surged, cross-functional collaboration that had been nearly impossible under the old hierarchical structure became routine. The quarterly financial reports, which I now reviewed with the same obsessive attention to detail I'd applied to the acquisition, showed real growth. Sustainable growth built on actual innovation and operational improvements rather than the financial engineering and artificial inflation that Richard had relied on. My marriage was a completely different story, far more complex and painful than the corporate transformation. Sarah moved into the guest room the night of the dinner and stayed there for 2 months, creating physical distance that reflected the emotional chasm that had opened between us. We were civil to each other, even kind in our interactions, but there was a distance that felt impossible to bridge, a fundamental trust that had been broken. She was processing not just what I had done, but what it meant about our entire relationship, about how well she really knew the person she'd married, about whether she could trust someone who had kept such massive secrets for such an extended period. We started couples therapy 3 weeks after the dinner, which helped provide structure to our attempts at rebuilding, though the process was consistently painful for both of us. "You made me feel small," she said during one particularly difficult session, her voice breaking with emotion she'd been holding back. "All those times I pushed you to get a job, to do something meaningful with your time, to contribute more to our household. I was operating from this place of fear that we weren't enough, that you weren't enough, that our future wasn't secure. And you just let me feel that way. Let me worry unnecessarily. Let me and your colleagues and everyone mock both of us when you could have just told me the truth." "I know," I said, because I did understand the impact of my choices. "And I'm genuinely sorry for that part of what happened. I could have found ways to reassure you without revealing the specific details of the acquisition. I could have managed your anxiety better, could have shared enough to make you feel secure without compromising the strategy. I chose the purely strategic path over the compassionate one, prioritized perfect execution of the plan over your emotional well-being, and that wasn't fair to you or to our marriage." "But you'd do it again," she said, and it wasn't quite a question, more like an accusation seeking confirmation. I thought about it carefully before answering, understanding that honesty mattered more than comfort in this moment. I don't know, I admitted finally. The acquisition worked exactly as planned. The company is being genuinely transformed in ways that are benefiting hundreds of people. Jobs that would have been lost are secure now. Innovation that would have died is flourishing. But the cost to us, to our marriage, to your ability to trust me, I honestly can't say if that equation balances properly. Maybe some things aren't meant to be calculated that way, reduced to strategic cost-benefit analysis. It took 6 months of consistent effort, of therapy sessions and difficult conversations, and small gestures of reconnection, but gradually, carefully, we found our way back to each other. Not to the relationship we had before, that was gone forever, built on incomplete information and unbalanced power dynamics that couldn't be restored, but to something new, something more honest, and potentially more stable. Sarah saw me fully now, including the parts that calculated and strategized and kept secrets when I deemed it strategically necessary. And I saw her more clearly too, saw how my silence and my strategic thinking had contributed directly to her insecurity, how my choices had sometimes crossed the line from strategy into manipulation, even if that hadn't been my conscious intent. "I need you to promise me something," she said one night about 9 months after the dinner. We were in our bedroom, actually sharing it again after months of separation. The guest room returned to its normal purpose as occasional accommodation for visitors. "I need you to promise that you'll never keep something that's significant from me again. Not because I can't handle complexity or because I need to know every detail of your work, but because marriage has to be a genuine partnership, and partnerships require shared information, even when it's strategically sensitive information." "I promise," I said, meeting her eyes, meaning it completely. No more secret empires. No more major life decisions made unilaterally without including you in the process. She laughed, which felt like an unexpected gift after months of tension. "One empire is probably enough for anyone anyway. I don't think I could handle discovering you'd secretly bought another company." The 1-year anniversary of the dinner approached, and Hexagon was genuinely transformed in ways that went beyond my initial projections. Revenue was up 43% year-over-year, driven by new product launches and market expansion. Employee retention had improved so dramatically that we'd become a destination employer in the industry. We'd launched 3 new products that were getting serious market attention and industry awards. The stock price had tripled, which meant the shares I owned were now worth considerably more than my initial investment, but also that everyone else's shares, including Richard's options that had vested, had increased substantially in value. I ran into Richard at an industry conference about 10 months after the dinner, our first face-to-face meeting since that night. He looked good, actually better than I'd seen him during his final years as CEO, more relaxed, less burdened by the constant pressure he'd been under. He'd taken a position as a senior advisor to several technology startups, roles that let him use his natural charisma and presentation skills without the operational pressure and technical demands of running an actual company. "Samuel," he said, approaching me during a break between sessions, offering his hand. I shook it, feeling the strangeness of the moment, the complexity of our history. "I heard Hexagon is doing remarkably well under the new leadership." "It is," I confirmed simply. "Maria is doing an excellent job, better than I could do in that role, honestly, which is exactly why I hired her instead of trying to run it myself." He nodded, something complicated crossing his face, regret mixed with acceptance, perhaps, or relief mixed with residual resentment. "I wanted to hate you, you know. 4 months after that night, I wanted to hate you intensely for what you did, for how you did it, for the public humiliation of being removed in front of everyone. But the truth is, you were fundamentally right about me and about what I was doing to that company. I was failing Hexagon systematically. I was so focused on looking successful, on maintaining appearances, on managing perceptions that I forgot to actually be successful in any meaningful way. That's a hard thing for someone like me to admit. It takes real courage to admit it," I said honestly. "Most people in your position never do, never achieve that level of self-awareness. They just blame external factors, or bad luck, or other people's inadequacies. What you did that night," he continued, his voice lower, more reflective, publicly humiliating me in front of everyone I worked with, stripping away all my authority in one brutal reveal. Part of me understands it was strategically necessary for the transformation you wanted to achieve. But part of me still thinks it was unnecessarily cruel, that you could have found a gentler way to accomplish the same goal. It was both, I admitted, appreciating his honesty enough to match it. Necessary and cruel. I could have handled the transition differently, more privately, more kindly, with more consideration for your dignity and feelings. But I chose shock and awe deliberately because I wanted to send an unmistakable message to everyone in that room, not just to you personally. I wanted them to understand that everything had changed completely and irrevocably, that the old system was dead and something entirely new was being born. Sometimes the message requires the method to be harsh, to be fully effective. Do you regret it? He asked directly. The way you handled it. I considered the question carefully, understanding it deserved a thoughtful answer. I regret the pain it caused people who didn't deserve it. My wife learning about my life's work in front of her colleagues. Good employees who lost their jobs in the transition simply because they were too tied to the old system to adapt. But do I regret forcing the change itself, making it dramatic and undeniable? No. Hexagon was dying slowly under your leadership, and hundreds of people would have lost their jobs when it finally collapsed or got acquired for parts. The math on human suffering would have been much worse if I'd done nothing, if I'd prioritized avoiding temporary pain over preventing long-term catastrophe. He absorbed this silently for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, for what it's worth, I hope you handle the weight better than I did. The power and the responsibility that comes with it, they're much heavier than they look from the outside, from the position of wanting them. They are, I agreed quietly. I'm learning that every single day. As Richard walked away to rejoin his group, I thought about the lesson embedded in all of this, the thing that went beyond business strategy and corporate ownership and personal vindication. Power is genuinely strange in how it operates. We think we understand it when we see it in its obvious, conventional forms, titles on doors, wealth displayed conspicuously, formal authority expressed through organizational hierarchies. But real power, sustainable power, often works in the shadows of those obvious structures, building infrastructure and accumulating resources while everyone else is distracted by the performance, by the visible markers that don't actually determine outcomes. The quietest person in any room isn't always powerless or irrelevant. Sometimes they're just patient, watching carefully, learning from everyone else's mistakes, waiting for precisely the right moment to reveal what they've been building methodically while others were performing. And when that moment finally arrives, when the truth emerges from the shadows, it doesn't just change the immediate power structure. It changes everyone's fundamental understanding of reality itself, forces them to question every assumption they've made about who matters and who doesn't. That's the real lesson I learned through all of this, the insight that goes beyond the specifics of my situation. Not just that quiet competence eventually wins out over flashy performance, though sometimes it does. Not just that strategic thinking beats charisma in the long run, though that's occasionally true. The real lesson is about the danger of assumptions, about how we create massive blind spots through our unwillingness to look beyond surface appearances. We assume we know who has power and who doesn't based on visible signals, job titles, expensive clothes, confident presentation. We assume we understand someone's worth and capabilities based on how they present themselves in social situations. We assume that silence or withdrawal means nothing important is happening, that the absence of obvious activity equals the absence of any activity at all. But assumptions are dangerous precisely because they create blind spots where entire empires can be built without anyone noticing or caring. They let us dismiss people who might actually be the most dangerous or most valuable person in the room. They make us feel secure and comfortable when we should be questioning everything, when we should be looking deeper, when we should be considering possibilities we haven't imagined. If there's one thing I want people to take from my story, one insight that might actually change how they navigate the world, it's this. Never assume you know the full story based on what you can see on the surface. The person you're casually dismissing, the colleague you're pitying, the spouse you're underestimating, the quiet employee who never speaks in meetings, they might be building something you can't see, something that will eventually become visible in ways that shock you completely. They might be playing a game you don't understand with rules you've never encountered. They might be 3 moves ahead while you're still celebrating what you think is your victory. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits in the shadows patiently, accumulating resources gradually, gathering information meticulously, preparing for the moment when revelation will have maximum impact. And when that moment comes, when the quiet person finally speaks with authority, when the underestimated reveal their hand completely, when the invisible empire becomes undeniably visible, that's when everything changes fundamentally and irrevocably. I still attend Hexagon's company dinners regularly, but the dynamics have shifted completely. Now I'm introduced as the majority shareholder, the architect of the turnaround, the man who saved the company from slow decline. People actively seek my opinion on strategic matters, ask for my insights on industry trends, treat my words as inherently valuable. It's gratifying in some ways, validating after years of dismissal. But it's also slightly hollow, because these same people would have ignored me completely if I'd walked in with exactly the same ideas, but without the formal authority to back them up, without the power that makes people listen regardless of content. Sarah and I host some of the company events now, opening our home to employees, creating spaces for the kind of authentic connection that was systematically missing under Richard's leadership. She's different now too, fundamentally changed by what happened, more cautious about making assumptions about people, more aware of the gap between appearance and reality, more willing to look beneath surface presentations. Her career has actually flourished in the new environment at Hexagon, freed from the political constraints that had limited her before. Turns out she's brilliant at complex project management when politics aren't the primary obstacle to getting things done, when competence matters more than hierarchical positioning. Last month, a young engineer named David approached me nervously at one of these home events. He was quiet and unassuming, exactly the kind of person who blends into the background at corporate gatherings, who people overlook automatically. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did, for the changes you made. Before the transformation, I was actively planning to leave Hexagon. I had developed some ideas for innovation in our core technology, but no one would listen to me. No one took me seriously because I was too junior, didn't have the right connections. Now I'm actually leading a major project that might genuinely change our industry, that might create real value." "What's the project specifically?" I asked, genuinely interested. As he explained his work in detail, describing the technical challenges and innovative solutions with growing enthusiasm, I recognized something familiar in his energy, his excitement tempered by years of being systematically overlooked and dismissed. "Have you been documenting all of this carefully?" I asked when he finished his explanation. "Keeping detailed records of the development process, the breakthroughs, the challenges you've overcome, the decisions you've made?" "Some documentation," he said, looking confused by the question. "The standard project management records." "Why do you ask?" "Because someday you might want to tell the complete story of how this innovation came to be, how it developed from initial concept to finished product," I said carefully. "And stories are dramatically more powerful, more credible, more impactful when they're backed by solid evidence, by a clear and detailed record of the entire journey from initial invisibility to final impact." He nodded slowly, understanding beginning to spark in his eyes. "You kept meticulous records of everything. The acquisition process, the financial analysis, the strategic planning, all of it. That's how you could reveal it all so effectively, so completely that no one could dispute it." "Documentation is power," I confirmed. "Memory fades over time, perspectives shift based on outcomes, people rewrite history to make themselves look better, but records persist unchanged. Whatever you're building right now, whatever you're planning for the future, keep careful track of it all. You never know when you'll need to prove definitively what you've accomplished, when you'll need evidence that can't be disputed or dismissed." As I watched him walk away, already pulling out his phone to start organizing his documentation more systematically, I felt something unexpected, genuine hope, not just for myself or for Hexagon specifically, but for the broader idea that maybe we're slowly moving toward a world where quiet competence gets recognized earlier, where people don't have to build secret empires over years just to be taken seriously, where the engineer with genuinely good ideas doesn't have to wait indefinitely for someone in formal authority to notice and validate them. But until that world exists fully, until we've really fundamentally changed how we value actual contribution over charismatic presentation. There will be more stories like mine playing out in companies and organizations everywhere. More people building patiently in the shadows, accumulating power invisibly, waiting for their precise moment to reveal what everyone else completely missed. More dinner parties where the uninvited guest turns out to own the venue. More assumptions shattered by revelations that were always coming, inevitable for those patient enough and observant enough to watch for the signs. The night I walked into that company dinner uninvited, the night I revealed my ownership and removed a CEO in front of everyone, I changed far more than Hexagon's leadership structure. I changed fundamentally how everyone in that room thought about power, about potential, about the genuine danger of underestimating the quiet ones who seemed to have removed themselves from competition. That lesson echoed far beyond that single evening, spreading through professional networks and casual conversations, becoming a story people tell as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that things aren't always what they appear to be. Be extremely careful who you dismiss based on appearances. Be genuinely cautious about making assumptions about people's capabilities or worth. Remember that the person you're overlooking today might be the most important and powerful person in the room tomorrow. And if you find yourself in a position of power, use it carefully and thoughtfully, because someone is always watching, always learning, always preparing for the moment when they'll reveal what you couldn't see coming. Real power doesn't need to announce itself constantly or perform for validation. It just needs to wait patiently for exactly the right moment. And when that moment finally arrives, when the truth emerges completely from the shadows, it doesn't just change the immediate power structure. It changes absolutely everything about how people understand their world and their place in it.